Good morning, everyone. My name is Max Minkoff. I'm one of the programmers here at ACMI's film team. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the unceded land on which we're gathered today, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the East Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you all for joining us so early on a Saturday morning for this special screening of the importance of being being an architect, co-presented by RMIT. I have a feeling I'm probably the person in the room who knows the least about architecture, and I'm therefore the least qualified to present it. But that is why I'm especially excited for the panel discussion that is taking place after the screening. So make sure you stick around after the credits roll, as we'll be joined by Professor Martyn Hook, Dean of RMIT's School of Architecture and Design and Director of Iredale Pedersen Hook Architects, Mauro Baracco, Director of Baracco Wright Architects, Amy Muir, Director of Muir Architecture, and Iva Foschia, Founder and Lead Architect at IF Architecture. The film is screening as part of the Milan Design Film Festival at ACMI, which is a co-presentation with the Italian Cultural Institute of Melbourne. There's a stack of great titles in the season on architecture, design, sustainability, food, even Italian disco. So if over the next week and a half you feel you need some escapism from the federal election, particularly depending on the outcome overnight, I highly recommend you check out some of the titles. I hope you enjoy the film. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Professor Martyn Hook. Thank you for joining us this morning on this particularly historic day of democracy. And we are indulging ourselves in front of this very earnest, very rich and quite beautiful piece of cinema that I think possibly raises more questions than answers any. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we are today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just a quick intro to our panel this morning to build on Max's introduction. Thank you, Max. We have Dr. Mauro Baracco, who sort of is our honorary Italian consulate here this morning as a renowned educator for more than 30 years at RMIT. He's now focused in practice with Louise Wright at Baracco Wright. And they're really well known for their work in regenerative landscapes and their relationship with architecture. And along with Linda Tegg, they were the creative directors of the Australian Pavilion at the 2018 Venice Architecture Biennale, which certainly provoked a lot of conversations amongst the Italian community. They also continue practice with quite an exquisite set of residential projects and are also focused in research work that looks really at the impact of Italian architects such as Vito Magistretti. And they've produced a number of beautiful publications in and around this work. Next to Mauro, we have Iva Foschia. She's RMIT alumni and the founder of IF Architecture, who have been responsible for crafting some of Melbourne's most sumptuous interiors for restaurants such as Attica. And I was just saying the thing that Attica is obviously missing is a drummer. And Cutler & Co. And also recently the Prince, alongside commercial showrooms for Jardin and Luxaflex. And also she's got an increasing portfolio of residential projects. She has particular interest in Italian architecture and industrial design of furniture and objects, such as the Memphis group, which we heard mentioned today, and really draws on her own Italian heritage to inform her work that's really theatrical, but also sort of grounded in this quality of space that we heard discussed today. And Amy Muir, on my immediate left, is Director of Muir Architecture and a former President of the Australian Institute of Architects Victorian Chapter. And alongside Mark Jakes at Openwork, you may know her work at the NGV, at Double Ground, the NGV Architecture Commission in 2018, which has been recognised in national and international awards programs. And certainly through her teaching at RMIT, she also explores an architecture which is grounded in material and light, but also has a very conscious understanding of making, which again we heard today, but probably also she has an interest in the evolution of the architecture profession from her work with the Institute. So I will begin questioning. It's fantastic that you could all join us this morning. And I thought I might open, Mauro, with you. Maybe just a little bit of context here, because what we've seen in the film is perhaps not necessarily paralleled in an Australian context. And really what we have here is a very particular set of circumstances that surround architects in Italy and the production of architecture in Italy. And I wonder if you could give us somewhat of a background of the nature of the profession there and perhaps how it is different from here.
Okay, thanks. I would say that probably this documentary film also doesn't, in my opinion, shows what's happening also at the general level in the world of architecture and design in Italy. Citerio is 72 years old. I check in Wikipedia, and so this movie was done 2 years ago, and he's part of that generation of great architectural thinking that emerged in the Second World War. It's interesting that Dejan Sujic, when makes the difference, he says Citerio was not really with the radical thinking of people like Sozzas, Branzi, Mendini. There was also Archizum. Also, Archizum at that time were not from Milan; they were operating from Florence. Yet at the same time, he's not also part. It was mentioned that one of the teachers was Achille Castiglioni, and the irony of Castiglioni, the irony of Enzo Mari, the irony of Vico Magistretti is not really part of the work by Citerio, would say. And I don't totally agree. I lived 10 years in Milan when I was young, and just after graduation. And I don't totally agree when they say that Milan is not a beautiful city. Or I agree with the fact that Milan is not probably as beautiful as Rome, Venice, Siena, and all this. But at the same time, Milan, it has a traditions which has a grain of beauty somehow. I would use the term spunk. There is a tradition of restrained building with spunk. If we think of Caccia Domignoni, Magistretti, Gardella, Zanuso, Albini, some of them have been named, there is always something which is particularly Milanese. And the fact that Citerio is neither here with the radical or there with this Milanese tradition. Somehow also he is a Milanese. His accent is beautifully Milanese. He makes, and I get to the point, he probably places in this trajectory of very rare practitioners today that rely on very rich clients. We probably also made him pretty rich, a house in the mountains, a house at the lake, all these beautiful things in his house, which is fantastic for him. Well done, but this is not, in my opinion, the typical conditions of Italian architects. There is no work. Many Italian architects, there's such a very high number of Italian graduates in architecture. They have to go outside to practice, to go outside Italy. There is no work apart these 3 or 4 big firms. And coming back to, and I finish here, to the fact that he's in between these two traditions, he makes, in my opinion, his work probably proficiently and exceptionally well built, because when you have such high budgets, you can't muck around. You have you have clients who pay so much in fees and in budgets that they want to have everything perfect, so perfectly built, but a bit soulless, in my opinion. Part of this world of commercial, high-end commercial architecture, which is not the probably the average situation in Italy. Maybe a little bit more in Australia, where there is less crisis at the moment, so it's relatively easier in Australia now to run practice that can be commercial, because as we know, there are cranes everywhere, and Australia is building much more than Italy, I think.
Thank you. Maybe, Iva, I could move to you. I mean, we saw a very romantic idea about the profession that many of us are engaged with every day, and walking around in the snow, wandering around on building sites, looking pensively at the things that are emerging in front of us. Is this romantic vision appropriate in this film, or do you think there's something missing here about the sort of messiness of making buildings?
Maybe if it was very messy, no one would want to come to watch it. Well, yes, it's a very romantic film, and the scenery is very beautiful, but perhaps Italians have a reputation for being very romantic, so it's well suited, and their point of view. I think my everyday, and maybe the everyday of people practicing here in the room, is very different to what is shown on screen, and it is the moment that you get a project or you're engaged for a project, the world is full of possibilities, and you haven't quite thought of the realities of their budget or the conditions in which you're working. So it's there, this sort of aspiration, or as they sort of talk about as well, this sort of beautiful creativity and possibility. But a lot of these projects are, and they are a firm also that is the 1% for the 1%ers, and majority of architecture is not that way, and especially, say, for my practice itself. So there's the realities of everyday work, which have more to do with being a diplomat, a negotiator, a psychologist, a bookkeeper. That is probably 95% of my practice, but maybe not as interesting to watch.
The way in which the filmmakers sort of frame this idea about detail, the notion that the architect is the one that's able to sort of observe materiality and understand the way that these things come together. Do you feel that there is a authenticity in that idea, or do you think that that again pushes into an assumption of what being an architect is, as opposed to those sorts of realities?
A bit of everything. Yeah, like there, obviously to do what we do, we have, a sensibility and a passion and maybe an intuition for detailing and materiality and beauty, and an idea to investigate those things, but that's not solely our domain. It's not solely within the realm or outside of the realm for other people. It's just that that's what we've chosen to devote our life to, and it's an expertise. It's an expertise that we have then, because that's what we're doing often, and just not the sort of everyday of other people, if that answers the question.
And probably sort of leads into a question for you, Amy, which, I mean, in your work, which engages very directly with landscape and is increasingly engaged with social concerns. Your recent memorial for victims of domestic violence up near Parliament, I think, talks to this shift in the ways in which architects are perhaps now really drawn into very different social concerns alongside responses to the climate crisis, alongside engagements with recognition of Indigenous sovereignty. And it seems that those levels of complexity that were raised in the film now increasingly become part of the architect's job, above and beyond producing spaces for shelter or spaces for corporate entities. Just wondering whether, from your perspective, there is a reflection in the film that maybe goes far enough to talk about that social license that architects have, and perhaps whether that's a new thing or whether it's something which is re-emerging because of the things that we find ourselves faced with.
Yeah, look, I think the film probably negated that role that we play as architects, as advocates within public architecture, and I think that was probably, it's starting to be touched on in terms of what our role is, in terms of engaging with sustainability, but it because of the nature of the work that we were being exposed to in this film, we weren't necessarily understanding the role of the civic and how important the civic is as a place where all people gather, and that this isn't necessarily about just sort of the 1% that we're sort of acknowledging. But I think increasingly, yes, I would agree. I think it is always civic architecture has always existed and is obviously incredibly fundamental to the way that cities are planned and understood, and that role of civic architecture certainly contributes to how we understand society and how it works and operates, and the underlying generosity that comes with civic architecture. But that role that needs to be played in society, as you're sort of alluding to, is really important. Advocating through architecture, and the fact that these projects have a role to talk to how society potentially can sort of guide itself, I think, is becoming increasingly important. And particularly sustainability. I mean, this weekend we're talking about it, but how does that actually manifest itself in the built environment in a really meaningful, constructive way?
Mauro, maybe I'll get you to pick up on that one a little. I'm interested in perhaps how, through your work into regenerative landscapes, starts to really try and address that relationship between buildings as buildings and nature as nature. And we saw here this reference in China to the ways in which architecture and nature work together, and that there was this idea about a kind of partnership between the built environment and the natural environment. How does that sit with you, considering the actual buildings that we're seeing as part of this dialogue?
Yeah, well, it's true. Lots of people here were talking about relationship with nature, but I don't see this actually happening. To me, in the way nature and culture or architecture deal, they still probably are kept in a very separate situation. What we've been tasting for many years and what we believe is that if you really believe in climate change and terms such as urban resilience, urban sustainability, how to become resilient, how to mitigate natural disaster, or anyway, how to contribute through architecture and urban design into the discourse around climate change, you really need to become serious and effective in integrating urban environment with natural ecologies, which is not just, in my opinion, designing glass facade. They are talking about sustainability. I would be curious to know a little bit more about what they mean by sustainability. Also, symptomatically, in my opinion, is that when he's commissioned to design the headquarters for the Zegna company just across the Prada Foundation in Milano, he's not willing to deal with the apparently beautiful existing industrial building. He says, sorry, we have to demolish, which is a kind of heroic way of dealing with, if you want to be sustainable, we all know that the first rule of sustainability is to not build from scratch, not to contribute to waste, and to deal with what we've got, to adapt, to refit. This is what things that we are interested in at the moment, and that we see more and more relevant in terms of urban, in terms of approaching or relating and addressing urban sustainability. And one other thing is that the film starts well in saying architecture. I totally agree, architecture should make people feel good. But then there are no people symptomatically in the way it is filmed. There are musicians. It seems that somehow there are more music trying to relate the building to the context. And also, there is not so much evidence. This is I'm not saying that the buildings are ugly or not well done. Probably the opposite. I'm not sure about ugly or beautiful. I leave that alone. But certainly very well done. But I think, and because I see there are quite a lot of young people, and we are talking also indirectly to the new generation of architects. To me, this is not probably the most relevant way to think of what architecture role should be for addressing important topics like climate changes, social inequality, and indigeneity, or relationship with the place, which was another thing that was mentioned so many times here.
Amy, I'll just maybe let you pick up on that thread a little bit about, and maybe to come back to your point around the civic. When we begin to think about architecture for people, what does that actually mean within this place, and how might it begin to evolve with a sense of criticality more than anything else?
Yeah, are we talking Milan?
Sure, we can talk Melbourne.
Well, I think what Mauro is sort of touching on, the idea of context as well. And it was in the film, it was very difficult to understand the context that a lot of these buildings were sitting within and their relationship to that context. And I think, when we talk about the way that cities operate, they are essentially for people. And so when we talk about how buildings relate to the greater context, so the greater city, their neighbours, the adjacent buildings, this is something that's incredibly important in terms of how we understand how people relate to place as well. So I think that was one thing that I was really desperate. I was kept sort of feeling quite desperate about seeing those buildings in a greater context, or their relationships that they were establishing. But if we talk about that as one thing, and then the role of civic, I think one of the things that we've probably that's become very apparent through the pandemic is how important external space is and the relationship that has to architecture. And we need places where we can sit, we need places that we can be, we need places that we can congregate within. And I think civic space is not only, the building, the library, the town hall, the art gallery, the museum, but these are spaces that sit also next to, adjacent to, and become part of a greater conversation. And I think that is something that the relationship that has to landscape as well, I think, is something that we're obviously very interested in understanding. But being able to be in those spaces is very important. And, you know, as we're seeing, you know, talking about the diversity of what architecture actually is, it goes beyond obviously civic. It's, you know, it's residential. And when we see the way that cities are developing, they're incredibly dense. You know, that the access to open space is very limited compared to what it once was. And so how, you know, what are these relationships between building and landscape when we talk about the role of civic, I think is becoming increasingly important.
And I think from my perspective, in the context of the Australian city, I mean, we have a very high percentage of our population on our island live in our main urban centres, you know, upwards of 85, 86%. And I think that even post-pandemic, we're beginning to now reevaluate what the post-colonial city is from an Australian context, and perhaps we're at a point whereby we stop looking at Milan and we stop looking at London and we stop looking at New York, and we actually really focus on what is the Australian city and how is Melbourne different to Sydney, different to Brisbane, and what opportunities do we see there emerging, not only from this relationship between landscape and built form, but also what do we want our cities to be as places where people can collect and gather and agglomerate. I mean, I think there is a whole dialogue there that the kind of gratuitous drone shots over the top of the building tend to kind of miss out on. And I think that is that real collision of human capital for all of its positive and negative that makes things really engaging in an Australian context. Maybe if we change gear just a little bit, I was really intrigued by the commentary around architects that design other things, and as the ways in which Diane Sujic was talking about Chiterio rethinking the sofa. Like, we didn't know what sofas were until he came along. And Iva, I'm interested in the work that you do in crafting these beautiful spaces that are really in dialogue with the objects that are within them and the food that is served within them and the pieces that exist within them. How you see Chiterio's contribution into that realm of architects that design other things.
Very influential. It was interesting, you know, hearing Diane Sujic talk about that, and then all of the sort of iconic Chiterio pieces that were in the film. You know, that Desis sofa that was in their office, the black one with the really big arm. You know, that is, you know, when you look at it in the context of the 1970s, you know, you've got a very deep sofa that you could almost sleep on and a very wide arm. It was very influential. It still is influential, along with lots of his other pieces. You know, his creative direction for B&B Italia and Max Alto, even though we might not know these pieces by name, but it's gone on and influenced a whole, you know, generation of interior designers and architects and product designers that have gone on to develop and continue to develop those ideas in furniture and product design. I think, you know, Mauro said, you know, he's obviously very successful. You know, the royalties from all of that furniture is probably what's made him more wealthy than his architecture.
That bought the lake house.
Yes, you know, and it's interesting for maybe a new generation of architects around the world and even within Melbourne who are also developing other things apart from their architecture, because it goes to form part of their vision for the space and how that space is inhabited, but also maybe it goes to that thing of we have to try and find alternative methods of income, not just the architecture itself or the, you know, the fees from projects. So I think that in that way, say in my own practice, say in hospitality or so, that hospitality spaces are an extension of people's homes, to the things that Amy was talking about, the civic spaces. If you might be living in the city in a space that's relatively small, your local cafe or restaurant is now a place where you meet your friends, you spend hours there. It's not necessarily in just your living room. So in terms of how we're thinking of those spaces, it's about the longevity of the space, but also the comfort of the space, the ability to create an atmosphere that you feel welcome. For the most, hospitality is all about being hospitable and making you feel welcome, and so that you have, those items that are deeper or have really good ergonomics, so that you, without even knowing, that you feel like that's a space that you are happy in or content in. Not that, the chairs are really uncomfortable and hard and maybe you only stay there for half an hour and then you have to go. So I think Citerio does that very well, and the images that are throughout the documentary also, and Dejan Sujic said this as well, that they're minimalist but they're also very sensual, and you can see that in the in the leather, in the form, sort of quite curvaceous forms, but they are quite refined, but they're very tactile and beautiful to touch, which is obviously very important at that scale.
Go on, Mauro.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
I agree totally with what you've said, and is furniture and the product design are very excellent, beautiful, but also working perfectly well when we have rarely, or when we can afford to have some clients who can afford, we like to specify the kitchen that he designed for our cleaner. But what I want to say is that to me is symptomatic of an architect who is probably very able can master the design at that scale, which is a scale that doesn't relate necessarily to a specific place, because of furniture or product design, it's something that can be everywhere. And that says it all, in my opinion, making the difference between the small scale of his design and the larger scale of the architecture. It's something that I also find in another Italian architect who has worked here, Mario Bellini. If you look at the architecture of Bellini and the product and furniture design, Bellini has designed fantastic piece of furniture design that are even in the best collections of architecture in the world, or architecture or industrial and furniture design. When it comes to architecture, it's symptomatic that Mario Bellini himself asked a guy Olente to design his own house. So, yeah.
Okay. So if we talk about clients a little bit, because I think one of the intriguing things about this film is the prominence that the client takes. Generally old white men, industrialists who sort of talk about the embodiment of the architecture in some way of their kind of value system. Strikes me as well that the film doesn't perhaps convey the contemporary idea of the client. And Amy, I'm interested from your perspective, just around this kind of idea about what the client is and who the client is within a contemporary architectural dialogue.
Yeah, I think, it's not singular, that's for sure. I think it's the client. We know, obviously, there's the brief, but the brief is being generated, generally speaking, if we talk about public projects, for instance, there's a huge amount of consultation that occurs in order for that brief. So there's many voices that are influencing the way a brief is articulated in the first instance. But then I think if we talk about that form of consultation, that's, you know, that isn't just, you know, immediate people, that is also a broader kind of understanding of what the city requires and what the people require. And then, I mean, the complexity of client bodies now, I think we understand them, you know, that there's many players in the way that projects are now being delivered, and aside from the consultation, that you've also got the way that the client and the builder now, on a lot of these projects that we're now seeing, the client and the builder are one, or almost slipping. And so this sort of very singular idea of an intimate conversation with a client is not necessarily a realistic understanding of what these relationships are now like. And I think this has obviously evolved through contractual arrangements, through the way that projects now get delivered, and this film obviously showed us construction sites in a very sort of romantic way, and not eliminated that sort of I can't even say it.
Collaboration?
No. I'm going to avoid that word. I know exactly what I'm thinking, but I'm going to avoid it. But I think I suppose what this film doesn't do in that representation of the client is the complexity of these relationships, and we don't. I think what I was trying to say before is that through what we understand as being a form of contractual arrangement at the moment, where most projects are being delivered in Melbourne and Australia and globally, it's becoming the norm, is a novated contract where basically we start with a client and then we're handed over to the builder, who is now our client. And so this slippage is really sort of changed the way that we understand the construction industry and the way it works, but also who is the client and who is in control and who is the person we're conversing with. And
today I can't help draw government into the conversation.
Yes.
And I was really surprised in this film that Patricia and Antonio didn't moan about government, because obviously working in Italy, in Rome, you can't dig a hole without it becoming an archaeological site. So how you actually make buildings in Italy, it is an incredibly drawn out process that involves many tiers of regulation, many tiers of government. And we don't see any of that. Yeah. It's all entirely straightforward. And so
chaotic is the word trying to remember. But it's exactly that. And I mean it's a very pleasant way of understanding how projects are delivered.
Do you think that there is a role for government, be it state or local or federal, in ensuring design excellence, and how do you do that?
Yes, 100%. This is something that we are constantly talking about or advocating for within our industry, is how you talk to the notion of quality. And we still, I think, I would like to think that it's less of a conversation. However, architects are still regarded as being people who add unnecessary stuff to projects, and it is an incredibly unfortunate thing to be blessed with or not blessed with, because it's a very difficult starting point on any project for the assumption to be that we're there to add stuff that's unnecessary, when our role is far more complex than that. And it's when we talk about all the various things that we're being called upon to be contributing to, and as you were saying before, Martyn, the role of architecture isn't one where we're just building and designing. We're actually having to negotiate, find ways to advocate, find ways to better the world that we live in. This isn't about gold plating. This is about the fundamentals of how society operates and works. So I think in terms of government understanding the value that we bring to projects, that is something that we have to talk about on a daily basis, because it gets forgotten, unfortunately, because the conversations come back to money, rather than what the value is that architecture brings to society. And these built outcomes, if they're not built correctly, and if they're not, and you know, we are increasingly seeing construction timelines getting faster and faster and faster, the delivery processes being expedited, this all compromises quality. And yes, you might get an outcome quicker, but that outcome may be severely compromised in terms of sustainability, longevity, and where it sits in the world in 10 years' time as opposed to in 20 years' time. And so, anyway, it's an ongoing issue.
Good points, thank you. And look, we'll just wind it out with a final question, which I just can't resist, which is really just this idea of what is it with architects and cinema? Like, why is there this kind of dialogue about, oh, we're cinema directors? Is it just, are there cinematographers who want to be architects? And is there something that kind of sits within that sort of dialogue? What, Eva, maybe we'll do one quick one each. What is it with this?
I think it's the desire to be in control of everything, probably, and to execute one vision all by yourself. I think we sort of touched on it before, but Wes Anderson is one of those people. Even Scorsese is one of those people who I think for frustrated architects probably, and then maybe architects are frustrated cinematographers or film directors. But maybe it's that thing of a vision, having a vision and wanting to see that vision come to life, and see it come to life in a way that a holistic way. And I think architects are very much like that, and film directors are like that too. That thing of controlling the light, and in architecture we do that. They talked about that in the film. So there's maybe lots of similarities. It's just obviously the medium is a little bit different.
Great, thank you, Mauro.
It probably comes to the seduction of the building as the objects, as the final product. You see Scorsese, Wenders, so many directors who are really in love with architecture, and they film architecture beautiful. But it's interesting that if we instead think of TV series, there are none, or I don't think any, about architecture. It's much more about doctors or lawyers. And because somehow doctors and lawyers have interesting things, exciting things in the everyday life, not architects. Eva before was saying, bookkeeping and go to discuss with so it's the aesthetic of the final thing. And maybe because of this aesthetic, directors and architects find a common ground there.
Amy?
Yeah, I was thinking, when we talk about sort of controlling what gets seen, in architecture, the photography of the final outcome is something that is hugely curated. And so I'm just wondering whether the film is another mechanism for curating it three-dimensional, through a way of understanding it spatially, and whether that's a terrible thing or not. Maybe that's okay. But I think, I think the thing that struck me about this is I was thinking every building should now come with a soundtrack, because it is evident that those buildings were very interesting because of the soundtrack. They became quite compelling. I was quite enjoying some of them. So I think that's something is the three-dimensional nature of architecture is to be explored through space. So if we take it in, understand it in those terms, I think it makes sense to make movies and narratives about buildings. It's the thing that we talk about narratives all the time. So it seems like an obvious thing to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I will let you all get back to queuing for your sausage. I was thinking when we were watching this film, one of my favourite reviews of cinema of all time was that film by Brad Pitt, who is interested in architecture, some of you might know, and Angelina Jolie, called By the Sea. The critic referred to it as a 2-hour-long perfume advertisement. And in some ways, that was just resonating for me while we were watching this. I thought it was a beautiful capture of a set of romantic notions about what architecture could be, and perhaps just sort of glossed over the bits that it didn't want to really accept and understand. But I agree. I think there should be more films about architecture. I think there should be more television series about architecture, other than the obvious ones. But I think that sitting and understanding and collectively thinking about what places and spaces might be and what they might contribute to community are critically important things to do. So thank you for joining us today. If you would join me in thanking our panel. And thank you to Max and ACMI for the opportunity. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend.